Mark Spreitzer grew up in Chicago. He has his bachelor's in political science from Beloit College. He's been on the Beloit City Council since 2011, and you're still the president of that, even though, okay.
Until April.
Well, I see, okay. Meanwhile, it's been busy. Meanwhile, in November, he was elected for the Assembly for the 43rd District down, and we've had him once before. We did a meet the candidates with him and the other person that was running for it, and I think we were all pretty impressed by him. So let's give a big hand for Representative Mark.
Good evening. Good to be with you again. I represent the 45th District, which is Beloit, Evansville, Broadhead area in Rock and Green County. And I'm just about 2.5 months into that. So I'm learning a lot about how the legislature works in a lot of different issues, but this is one issue that through my participation in Job and working with Ruth and the other people from Job who are here, I've heard a lot of the things in this presentation before, and I'm interested in getting more involved with them now that I'm in the legislature and have a chance to tackle them there. So I want to give a little bit of an overview of kind of what I think might be realistic on some of these issues, a sense of how the process might work in the legislature, and for those of you that are interested in being part of the advocacy on that, whether it's through the legislative day or at another time, sort of how we might frame the discussion that Ruth just presented in a way that might resonate with the people who are in the positions of power in the legislature right now. So the lay of the land in our state, of course, is that the Republicans are in the majority in both the Assembly and the Senate, and Governor Walker is the governor. So any policy change that requires legislative approval is going to require Republican support if we want to get it done now. And I think on at least some of these issues that's possible, but that affects how we frame some of the approaches to that. The other piece of the lay of the land is that and this is true in the Senate as well, but I'll speak more to the Assembly because that's what I'm more familiar with. There are 25 new members of the Assembly this January. That's 25 out of 99, so more than a quarter. And over half of the Assembly is new either this January or 2 years ago, serving first or second terms. So when we think about educating people and the fact that, I come into this a little bit educated from having participated in it, there are certainly others that do, but the average person in the legislature probably doesn't know most of what we just heard, and so before we can really get to the changing of policies, we have to just increase a basic awareness. And because we've had such high turnover, even if awareness activities have been done before, we've got a lot of new people that need to be educated. Now that means there's work to do. That also means that there's opportunities because people aren't necessarily hardened in their positions and might be open to learning new information. I think most people, both Democrats and Republicans who are new like me, have been pretty interested in attending presentations by a whole range of different groups on a lot of issues that might line up ideologically with where we stand or might not, but we're really wanting to learn what are all the issues out there. So I think there's that opportunity with new legislators to come in and raise their awareness on something, but we do need to do that. The other thing I would say is, this can't become a partisan issue if we want to make progress on it right now. If we had Democratic majorities who I think would be more ideologically inclined, certainly from the social justice perspective, to go along with some of this, it could do that. But right now, if it becomes a partisan issue, it's dead on arrival. And so I think that's really important to remember when you're having those conversations. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. I think it's a common sense issue. But if it starts to become that way, or even a left-right progressive versus not, it's not going to happen. And on that line, I think, I certainly am persuaded by the social justice issues that are at stake here. I suspect everybody in this room is. But I think a focus on the dollars and on some of the evidence in terms of what works and what doesn't, some of the arguments about the fact that people are going to end up coming out of prison at some point anyway, and so how do we make sure that when that happens, they're in a position to be safe in our communities, to support themselves and not rely on government assistance. Those are some of the kinds of arguments that I think are going to resonate with the majority in the legislature right now, and I think there's a lot of evidence behind those arguments, so focusing on that side of it sometimes more than perhaps what we might think just as justice might be a way of connecting with some people that otherwise wouldn't listen. So in terms of the state budget process, Some of these things, certainly the request for the $20 million a year, some of the issues around funding treatment alternatives and diversion, as well as some of the incentive structures in terms of the fact that those programs are really funded at the county level, whereas if we send somebody to prison, that's funded at the state level. Those are all potentially state budget issues, and right now we have between now and probably late May to make an impact on what the budget for the next 2 years is going to look like. So Governor Walker made his proposal February 3rd. Right now there's a series of listening sessions that the Joint Finance Committee is holding around the state. There's one today. There are 3 more scheduled. There are other listening sessions that either individual legislators will be doing or that Democrats in both the Assembly and the Senate are holding a series of sessions. But really that's an opportunity for public input into the process. And then what happens is the Joint Finance Committee, which is members of both parties from both the Senate and the Assembly, will get together and go through issue by issue in the budget and vote on any changes they want to make to the governor's proposal. And so, criminal justice, Department of Corrections will be one of those issue sections, and there will be a day or multiple days where they'll go through those issues, and they will have alternatives in front of them that they can either vote to move forward with the governor's proposal or make various kinds of changes, including potentially some of the ones we're talking about. So that'll be an important time to watch, because the next stage of the process is once they vote on all the different issues that are in the state budget, they end up with basically a new proposal that started as the governor's proposal, got changed by their committee, and so now we have a new budget proposal that comes out of the Joint Finance Committee and goes to the Senate and the Assembly. And at that stage, there are likely to be Democratic amendments that will be put forward. Chances are those won't be adopted. They'll be put forward more for messaging purposes to show this is the budget that we would pass if we had the ability to pass it, but we don't. And so chances are at that stage of the game, those amendments aren't likely to succeed. And then there will be an up or down vote on the budget. And so most likely whatever comes out of the Joint Finance Committee will already have support from the Republicans because they have the majority of the seats on the Joint Finance Committee, and so chances are that ends up being our next state budget. So we probably won't vote in the full Assembly and Senate until June, but the Finance Committee plans to be done by the end of May, and so that's pretty much the window for realistically making changes to the budget. So I think within there, one of the challenges that we have, and if we can think about ways of tackling that, is that some of the money saved, the money spent is one line item in the budget. Treatment alternatives and diversion, we need more money, and that's one line item in the budget. The money saved is saved in a lot of different places, and so we can do the study that calculates that it's $1.96 saved for every dollar spent, but it's not necessarily as straightforward to do that within the budget. And so I think figuring out how we can do it, because this is a very tight budget. There are a lot of cuts that I certainly want to see reversed to a lot of different programs. And the idea of finding a new $20 million in there, frankly, I don't think is terribly realistic. But if we can show it that it's not a new $20 million, it's a $20 million or more that we're already spending, and we're just asking to spend over here instead of over there, that's really how we need to approach that and make that case and bring in that evidence and show where is it being saved, and is it in a way that we can actually then cut spending on the place that we don't need it in order to increase that spending where we want it. So I think that's sort of how I would be thinking about that conversation. The transitional jobs piece, I'm glad that that's being expanded to Beloit. It's also being expanded to Racine. I think the fact that that's in the governor's proposal shows that there is an interest in at least some aspects of this from the majority party, and I think we can try to identify what are those areas that resonate and have that interest. And certainly I hope that we could see more expansion in that statewide going forward, so that that's something to pay attention to and look at. Can we measure the effectiveness of those programs in a way that makes the case that they need to be expanded? Just in terms of the tightness of the budget, their district attorneys had their lobby day and came up and were talking about needing more funding for assistant district attorneys all across the state, that their workloads are too high, they're backlogged on cases, they need more ADAs. That money didn't make it into the budget proposal either. So it's not just that there's not money in there for alternative programs, there's not money in the budget for just basic prosecuting of crimes and sending people to jail, which I think shows that it's not just that there's not necessarily support for this issue, it's that it's a really tight budget, even within Department of Corrections across the board. And just to give you kind of that context for where we're at. So that's, in terms of approaching the budget, bottom line is if you need new money, it's going to be really hard to make it happen. So really tying into the fact that it's not new money, it's a reallocation of existing money, is really the most viable way of approaching that. In terms of some of the standalone legislative issues that could be done separately, outside of the budget, and that don't necessarily cost money or that just directly save money, I think there's a few things that I don't have a good sense yet of whether they might be viable in the current legislative environment. I would have to have some conversations with colleagues that I haven't had a chance to have yet. I'm really still in the getting to know people phase of things and dealing with a lot of the issues that are coming at us right now, like the budget and like right to work and school accountability and some other big things that have come at us. But I think how we treat 17-year-olds, I would certainly like to see that be in the juvenile justice system, looking at the truth in sentencing laws, looking at the parole rules and solitary confinement. I think those are some of the things that don't necessarily have to be done by May or June because they're not budget issues, but we need to start figuring out who are the Republicans that really not just could vote for those, but could champion them. And the reason I say that is because it's very difficult in the current environment to get a vote on something unless leadership supports it. And so getting a couple of people that say, yeah, that sounds reasonable, I could vote for that, well, they'll probably never get the chance to. What we really need is somebody that can have that epiphany and say, this is something that really resonates. Not just I could go along with it, but now I'm passionate about it. And we need to get people on the Republican side that are actually passionate about some of these issues, that can make the case within the Republican caucus to their colleagues, to their leadership, and say, look, we're doing this all wrong, this isn't efficient, we're wasting money, we're not producing the outcomes we're looking for, and start to sell that. And so I think as in the legislative days, that really needs to be the focus, is identifying who are some of those people that can be a champion for that. A couple of things that are coming up. I hopefully will have an opportunity to do a prison visit. It's through the Wisconsin Supreme Court. We got an invite last week to sign up and basically rank order prisons that we'd be most interested in visiting, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that in later April. So I signed up for that. I'm very interested in getting into a prison and having the chance to see firsthand some of these issues and ask some questions of people there. So I'm hoping that will happen. I'm hoping other legislators who have that opportunity will take advantage of it. And then ban the box, I think that's one of those things where it certainly could be done at the state level, but building momentum locally is going to be the best way of getting to the state level, and also the best way of doing it outside of the current partisan environment. And then I think the other, in terms of standalone issues, there are various proposals that have already come forward that create new felonies. And I think it's important that we we create a consciousness about being really careful when we create new felonies, because every new felony we create is another person that's potentially in jail for that. And that's not to say that there aren't some new crimes that that are being identified as we keep up with new technologies and need to adjust the criminal code, but to look at, does it need to be a felony, and if so, are we keeping in mind the broader context that we're talking about here as we do that? And I've seen so many things come forward where I say, okay, yes, what you're talking about criminalizing is a bad thing, and we probably need to do something about that, but could it be a misdemeanor, or could it be a lower class of felony, or are we just jumping too quickly into that? And I think that would be another thing I might add to the agenda for that lobby day, is just talking to people about being more careful there. One example was we passed a law to ban upskirting, taking a picture up somebody's skirt without their permission, obviously. And I think everybody agreed that ought to be banned. hope of one of the authors of that bill in the Assembly was that at least for the first offense of that it would be a misdemeanor and then it would go to a felony for after that. The bill that we ended up passing made it a felony on the first offense. So those are some of the kinds of things that, even though, I think that's something that obviously is a real problem, we also need to at least be having the conversation about what's the appropriate point to jump into that felony thing, especially for something that the person who's doing it may well be that 17-year-old that doesn't have good judgment. So those are some of the other things I would just throw into the conversation. And I guess looking at the clock, I'll leave it at that, but would love to answer any questions.
It's your turn to ask questions and just identify the speaker if you have a particular speaker. And,
real quick, is the TAD, is that a going thing already, or does it have to be approved?
As I said, it started in Rock County from 2008.
Oh.
Now, when we went to the Board of Supervisors and asked for them to put 10% of that $56 million for expanding the jail, we asked to put 10% into treatment and alternatives. They not only put 10% into it, they put everything into it, and the jail no longer needed to be expanded. So we have an active criminal justice coordinating council in Rock County that coordinates all of that. And any county that has TAD has a criminal justice coordinating council that is in charge of it.
Thank you.
This is for Mark. In your spare time, this will take a while. Can you follow the money trail? Can you see where this $52,000 per person is going? It's going to be a breakdown. It's going to take you a long time. But I would like to know where that money is ending up, because that's part of the problem.
Sure.
Good question.
My understanding of the old law of prisoners is that the procedures are there for them to be paroled, but that somebody within that whole prison organization doesn't choose to make that happen. Is that true?
And when we find out where the money's going, we'll find out why that is.
And that's particularly why we have to guard against privatizing prisons, because then it's really going to be the goal of making money on people's.
Is there a push by Republicans or anyone to do that? Or privatizing prisons?
Not that I've heard in the time that I've been there so far, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. But it's not something that I've heard conversation about. The other thing I would add on the truth in sentencing piece, definitely for the people who predate that, they can still be released. It's just that they're not. But the other piece is that under the current law, the truth in sentencing law, judges can give the sentence that they think is appropriate to actually serve, but they're not. I mean, the expectation, or at least the theoretical expectation, was that if you have a truth in sentencing law, judges will sentence based on when people on average were being paroled before. But because judges have to run for election, they don't want to be the ones giving lesser sentences, so we end up with them giving the same sentence they gave before. When they gave it with the expectation it would be reduced, now they're giving it knowing it won't be reduced.
So they're afraid of the public.
Yeah.
All about us.
Great lobbying.
If we release prisoners because they're old and they're beginning to cost a lot of money for help, what are we going to release them to?
I forgot.
It's reminiscent of when we closed the mental institutions and we put the group out on the streets.
I forgot to mention that if they have a place to go. So
If they-
we want to make sure they have a place to go.
Yes.
Yes. Thank
Only
you
if
for
they
bringing
have-
that
Well,
up.
on that, I mean, it is cheaper to pay for transitional jobs, for subsidized housing in the community than it is to pay for keeping people in prison. So we can fund the necessary support systems outside of prison if we take the dollars we're spending inside of prison and shift it there.
Yeah. So Medicaid, they'd be eligible for in the housing Because if you want to put an elderly person into a nursing home, it might be $4,000 or $5,000 a month, but still, it's better conditions, and that's how much we're spending on them right now.
I'm sorry, you
Well, I was at, his name was Jerry Hickok, and
Hickok.
he talked about how we compared to Minnesota, and we had some of the same demographics.
Right.
And yet their numbers in their
Right.
prisons are much reduced compared to us. And the one point he brought up at that time is that when a prisoner is sentenced to prison in Minnesota, the county that they come from has to do some of that kind of payment to the state for their placement in the prison. And that seems to be one factor that has helped, he thought, reduce the number of people that went into the state prison system rather than being supported by maybe a program like you're talking about with TAD. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've looked into, or if that's something
A lot of, if you go to the 11x15 website, you'll hear a lot of that, and that's true. We compare ourselves to Minnesota, our demographics are similar, our prison population is twice as much. And so, yes, why is it twice as much? If the county has to pay for their prisoners, maybe it would make a difference. Maybe the county people would be speaking up and saying, wait a second, what's going on? Yeah. Tom?
I was just going to say, they've also had a much stronger restorative justice program in Minnesota for quite some time.
Yeah. Minnesota seems to have their act together.
The state of Michigan has a policy that for convicted felons, they will take and sell a house and take those assets, 90% of their assets, and apply it to the cost of the prison. Does Wisconsin do that?
No.
I've heard of it.
And they should, because they may have a family. Where's the family supposed to go if they had a family?
Oh, well, that's terrible, yeah, it's a terrible thing to do, because the family's out on
Yeah.
the street.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating that's a good idea.
I mean, you don't have to guarantee to be poor, and that really helps. Okay, someone else?
I have a rough recollection of two murderers that escaped a prison, and it turned out to be a private prison. They were found in Yellowstone and returned, but it made me think that Colorado, from the same newspaper articles I was reading in, Colorado had 13 private prisons. And I'd like to know where they can make a profit on having a prisoner. Are they getting tax money? The private prisoners, the prison's getting tax money?
I'm sure they are.
Right, when the states that have private prisons, the state has to guarantee 90% occupancy of the prison. So whether you're sitting, if you're sitting at 75%, you're still gonna pay for 90% occupancy.
Who is paying? Is it the taxpayers?
Yeah.
And that's why they're gonna make sure people go to prison whether
What's
they're guilty or
profit
not.
they made, that it wouldn't do you much good to be up for parole, because they wanna keep your warm
Right.
body in there. to fight
That's
life.
right.
The incentive is the key to end.
That's why I
Modern
asked,
version of the chain gang.
yeah, that's why I asked him to find out where the money's going.
This gentleman here?
As far as the private prison industry, through coordination with ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council,
Oh, my gosh.
wrote the 3 strikes and you're outlaw that exists in many states today, so that you've got misdemeanor criminals who have made a third mistake but pose absolutely no danger to society, but now they are incarcerated for life without parole. And the reason is because that prison is designed to show profit for every bed that's filled. And the object is to put as many people in and keep them there as long as possible. I'll give you an example. Georgia recently had an issue with their juvenile prison system. They had 3 private prisons in the state of Georgia. One was a juvenile facility. Found to be deficient in rehabilitating the people who were being held and incarcerated in that facility. And that was because, well, we can't rehabilitate them and show a profit. So the result was, instead of coming up to standards, what they did was they pulled out of all 3 private prison systems. After they pulled the money out of the system, then they just left them back to the state and says, fine, if that's the way we gotta be with it, you guys can have them. There's a lot of money to be made, a lot of problems to be made through the prison system, incarceration of human beings, so.
Yeah.
Is prisons, are the prison industries where there's money coming from though, or is it just the taxpayers?
Paid by taxpayers.
Well, then, so the people that are they own the building, they're gonna be making a profit then from the tax money.
It's all kinds of ways there.
Question?
Just, so, people are gonna hear about this TAD thing and are gonna say, no, that can't be, that it would work.
Oh, it does
So,
work.
You know,
We have to say it does work. We have to
Yeah.
let people know that treatment and alternatives do work. And then,
Right, I'm sure there's studies on this, I'm sure they can
Yeah.
demonstrate pretty
Yeah.
clearly.
because yes, we've had studies where recidivism is down with people who went through treatment instead of incarceration.
Right.
So that in itself says it works.
That information is on that website.
Yes, go to the website on your brochure,
Yep.
if you have a computer.
You have information on the Rock County program and how it's working?
You could go to the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council meetings and find out, but.
Tomorrow at 3.
Tomorrow at 3, at the courthouse.
Second floor.
So, actually, I can't give you any data on it. They could.
All the state money that comes through TED is monitored by the local criminal justice coordinating committee. If you don't have a criminal justice coordinating committee, you can't get any state money for TED.
That's right.
So about half the counties have criminal justice coordinating committee and about half don't. So the big thing I've heard is, well, the counties that don't have it are all pissed off because they're gonna get the money. When all they gotta do is set up an organization, which they're good at anyway. So, I don't know what the problem is.
Who's in charge of the criminal system in Wisconsin?
Department of Corrections?
Who is that? Who is that?
I
How is
think
he elected?